She's going to talk about kantha embroiderers, heritage, disruptions, and contestations.
So I want to start by thanking Deborah Thiagarajan, Sharath, Geeta, and of course Yogita and Vikas, who've made our trip so comfortable and easy. Thank you, everybody. So while the many eminent speakers who were rostered before me had the privilege of being present at the Maker and Meaning Conference 2 decades ago, I am a first-timer here. So I have a great deal of ground to cover, and my talk today is an attempt to make up for this lost time. Divided into 3 parts, I first present a brief background of near history on the genesis and developments that have led to the disruptions in the form and practice of what once was the recycled, quilted, and embroidered kantha. The second part covers its changing meaning over this time for its makers, while the third part is on the present. The embroidered kantha was historically a domestic textile tradition indigenous to the once undivided region of Bengal, employing a dense stitchery, worn-out cloth, usually saris and dhotis, were quilted and embroidered for use, giving them new life. The embroidery on these threadbare pieces of cloth was associated with thrift and domestic resourcefulness and was made by Hindu and Muslim women in Bengal for use by family or as gifts. The demanding nature of the embroidery required a laborious attention that the makers creatively individualized with their personalized markings. Their choice of motif and patterning made them prized family heirlooms that were imbued with an almost talismanic property. These embroideries were not viewed as objects for trade or for commerce, or as a source of income, but were worked on for domestic and personal reasons. But much was to change. In the span of time that is still remembered in Bengal, these kantha embroideries moved very markedly into the twin domains of markets and commercial exchange. A price value attached to this once personal expression. And we could perhaps trace the genesis to the end of the 19th and the turn of the 20th century. Kantha had by this time begun to attract scholarly attention and be systematically collected and written about by a long list of distinguished thinkers that included Guru Sadeh Dutt, an ICS officer, whose collection is housed in a museum under his name in Kolkata, the famed Indologist Stella Crambrish, who wrote and collected kanthas, now to be viewed at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, as well as the great Indic scholar Ananda K. Kumaraswamy and many others. In parallel, the visionary poet, writer, and Nobel laureate Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore had initiated a search into the indigenous roots of Bengal's culture, and with it a revitalization of its various arts and traditional skills. In 1919, as part of this ambitious project, he established Kala Bhavna, the House of Art, in Shantiniketan, where under the stewardship of the great artist Nandlal Bose, its pedagogy combined the fine arts with the crafts. In 1922, Tagore founded the Institute of Rural Reconstruction, renamed Sri Niketan. Its curricula emphasized the cultivation of artisanal skills as much as it did personal creativity. Under the guidance of Gurudev, kantha and other arts and crafts that were familiar in Bengal's households were introduced as a means of rejuvenating village crafts and promoting self-reliance. In the throes of the heady days of fervent nationalism, many took to the products produced at Sri Niketan, and by the end of the 1930s, they were being retailed through approximately 150 outlets across India. Its production was decentralized to households in rural Bengal, and thus, within the Swadeshi framework of rural reconstruction, the regeneration of the handmade through local crafts skills were not only fostered, but flourished in the patriotic economy of pre-independence. These efforts, though significant, were on a relatively low key as compared to the seismic social and economic changes and the reordering of society that were to be wrought after the partitioning of Bengal in 1947. The huge movement of population across the border and the continuing inflow of refugees over the decades required urgent and long-term efforts for income generation and employment for the many who had been displaced. And one such scheme built upon the Shantiniketan pedagogical legacy, the idea of training women in embroidery skills. This was turned into a tool of rehabilitation and a catalyst of empowerment for the women refugees. The strategy was seized on not just by government agencies, but social workers, NGOs, and others. And while examples abound of its successful implementation, I list just a few landmarks here that emphasize the general trend. In 1952, Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay was appointed by the government as the chairperson of the All India Handicrafts Board. It was under her guard that the Regional Handicrafts Training Institute was set up in Kolkata. Its first director was Prabhas Sen, a former student of Shantiniketan. The institute's performance, the quality of its training, remains legendary. In 1953, the Ganga Nagar Mahila Silpa Siksha Mandir was set up on the outskirts of Kolkata. The organization provided training to both local village women and the new migrants, helping augment family income while fulfilling, as their brochure put it, their natural desire for a place in society. Here, the Kantha unit produced high-quality silk scarves that were exported to the US. Its success was mirrored in a 1966 Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer newsreel on its activities. In 1961, the freedom fighter and legislator, Dr. Fulrenu Guha, founded Karma Kutir, again with the aim of rehabilitating women refugees by training them in economically viable skills, especially the kantha. In 1976, similar efforts were led by Father Laborde, a French priest at the Havra South Point Center. Also in 1976, Sri Lata Sarkar, a graduate of Kala Bhavna, began training women in kantha. In recognition of her contribution, she was honored by the President of India with the National Award in 1992, the first for kantha. There were in addition many others, from Sasha to Meera Mukherjee, a sculptor who trained the women to create stitch paintings. These large narrative wall hangings expanded on the kantha's potential for storytelling to include the depiction of topical social issues. In parallel were the initiatives of entrepreneurs and designers, too long to be listed here, who worked in the commercial space to push the boundaries of marketing the kantha. But it was Ranjana Sarkar, a former student of Shantiniketan, who is credited with being at the forefront of the development of the style and feature of the kantha patterning that is now commonly available. In 1985, she was asked to look at the work of Karu Sangha, the organization set up by Nandlal Bose, and suggest how to improve their kantha products. Realizing the tremendous potential of the stitches and the type of materials that could be used and the objects made, she started the trend that introduced the kantha stitch and style as we know it now. This reconstitution took on a life of its own, with the kantha embroidery moving inexorably to the new form that is commonly recognized today. And by the early 1990s, these new embroideries were positioned exclusively in the commercial domain, with an expanding market circulation and wide distribution. The use of kantha as a tool of income generation was a catalyst that had brought about change in the lives of women embroiderers, and the numbers now embroidering has been counted to be over 50,000. While in the past kanthas were embroidered across the social and economic divide, this is now the exception rather than the rule, with kanthas largely being worked on by women from economically deprived sections of society. This is of course not to say that the kantha is no longer being embroidered for personal use. but the vast majority comprises of those who embroider to earn a livelihood. In addition, as with other commercial embroidery forms, the kantha too is now largely produced for distant markets, with the embroiderer or the extended families no longer the end users, as was customary in the past. In the development landscape, the kantha is now a powerful force, and this shift can be seen in terms of the changing status and socio-economic standing of commercial kantha embroiderers, as it has brought with it an economic independence that allows them a greater voice within their families, with a marked improvement in social status within their communities. The women increasingly been seen as inspirational role models and game changers for others in the society they live in. In field research, we found a progressive shift in the way wage-earning women talk about their lives. Timetables, deliverables, schedules is increasingly governing their pace of life. Quality control, deadlines, price points are terms that they are now easy with household chores fitted in between their economic activity. And although no longer an expression of women's hopes, fears, aspirations, and joys, in this world of the digital, the wielding of the needle continues to have expression, now of independence, financial security, and income earning capacity, all aspirations of 21st century women, and increasingly more relevant to women's lives as markers of progress and change. Though this new mode of operation is increasingly characterized by context-free embroidery for distant markets and makes few demands on their expression and creativity, the women we spoke to value their work and took pride in their skill and their ability to earn a livelihood. But what of this mutated form itself? Well, despite these transitions and the changes in form and content of the traditional kantha, we are fortunate that something remains the same. And that is the kantha's continuing grip on the collective imagination of Bengal. From references in song, poetry, literature, and popular culture, the kantha evokes memories and associations with the cultural landscape of the region. In Satyajit Ray's movie, Gopi Gayan Bhaga Bajan, the zamindar is pictured soundly asleep in his opulent bed, covered with an intricately embroidered kantha, that he shrugs off as he is rudely awoken by the discordant notes outside his window. Ritu Ghosh in his film Bari Wali continued the tradition of evoking time and space with the kantha, while director Tarun Majumdar's 2003 film Alo has a heroine helping village women improve their lives through an exhibition of embroideries are just some such examples. In local bazaars as well as upmarket stores, it is common to see kantha embroidered products offered for sale. And what is heartening is that the kantha is asked for by name by customers, and not just in Bengal, but in urban markets across India. This is in itself a big plus for a regional embroidery form, as such unambiguous, clear, and strong brand identity forms a first principle of success in the marketplace. But what is the price that has to be paid for this spectacular growth? And the answer is that while branded as kantha, the embroideries that are so widely available are a far cry from the original. From a tradition of densely stitched tone-on-tone quilting with its huge vocabulary of personalized symbols and motifs, the kantha has transmuted into an embroidery on a single layer of cloth with a limited repertoire of stitches, and a patterning based on all current demands of the marketplace. The traditional form relegated to a niche practice. The very idea of the kantha has now mutated to this new look version. And while this embroidery style is not really new, as it has been decades in its development, I apply this term here for want of a better word to distinguish it from the heritage pieces. In an environment dominated by quick consumption, much of this embroidery has become a commodity with an indistinguishable sameness, ironically a handmade product that is imitating mass production and machine replication. And without being accused of nostalgia for a romanticized golden age or becoming a guardian of a bygone way of life, there is consensus on the price that has been paid in the process of commercialization. This development, unless it is stemmed, could lead to the kantha losing its regional identity. And yet, in spite of this, we cannot hypothesize on aspects of cultural conservation of the kantha heritage without examining the central issues of ensuring livelihood security and sustainability of the many thousands of embroiderers to whom this modified embroidery form provides home-based employment and income. And this is therefore most critical, as whatever is planned for the future needs to be viewed through the lens of the kantha makers. The other looming issue is the multiplication in factory-produced reproductions of kantha. And I have examples of printed kantha from across the spectrum, not just budget stores, but from really well-known high-end stores, from where these two pictures are from. And this is only just the tip of the iceberg. These acts of infringement all contribute to the corrosion of the livelihood base of the embroiderers and the regional identity of the kantha. So what is the path that can be followed to balance cultural conservation with the needs of makers and doers? The first is, of course, as I've already stated, to focus on the lives of the women embroiderers from a variety of perspectives. As we have all seen the effects of disruptions on their lives, the most recent of these being demonetization and the hard hand of the GST, that does not take into account the circumstances craftspeople work in, and least of all the women. Thus, while we need to address issues that are central to livelihood security, we also need to examine means of professional augmentation, especially in areas of self-development, upgrading of skills and capacities, in areas ranging from design to accounts, to use of digital media to marketing. And as regards cultural conservation, I place before you here, with a certain amount of trepidation, an idea for discussion. The idea is to develop a parallel route based not on the rejection of the new, but rather one of validation of the connection between the new and the heritage embroidery. In effect, continuing to retain the links between them, but reconsidering the relationship. By setting in place a process that rebuilds the legitimacy of the heir to the densely embroidered kantha tradition, while simultaneously giving stature and worth to the new kantha, in a way that precludes any form of prejudicial or unfair comparison. And perhaps the manner in which this can be accomplished is by an accountable and factual relabeling of the two styles that are currently both called kantha. The relabeling would work to retain the positive associations and affirmative links between the two kanthas, and could be the first step to stemming the steady ongoing erosion that are detrimental to both identities. This relabeling will need to stay within the scope of historical veracity, while including within the equation not just the interventions wrought in near history that shaped its form, but the continuing impact of dynamic contemporary developments. The suggestion is that perhaps the attributive term Shanti Niketan could be prefixed onto the new kantha, based on the reasoning that its genesis, commercial possibility, wide appeal, and its huge achievement in empowering women across Bengal was seeded by Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore and subsequently carried forward by well-intentioned, meaningful interventions that were exigent to their times. The changes wrought in women's lives have led over these decades to financial independence, income security, empowerment, all markers of progress and development. The hallmarking with the label Shanti Niketan carries the weight of vibrant creativity and a link to the past without any negative association. On the other hand, the contemporary heritage Kantha's nomenclature could have the appellation of Nakshi to the Kantha as it was earlier called, as that would be more accurate and precisely portray the tradition of the Nakshi of yore, bonded to its historic version and its heritage. However, to disturb and unsettle convention is not to be set on lightly. But while recalling the past, we need to set our sights on the present. On the present realities and what the future holds for the makers and the very existence of the form itself. Perhaps the time has come to draw a line in the sand. In conclusion, however, one single consistent thread remains, that whatever its label or name, the Kantha matters. It matters not only to the many thousands of women whose embroidery sustains them, but it matters as much to those who possess them, research about them, buy them, trade them, and as universally, the Kanthas are not seen merely as just a stitch or a technique, but a link with shared histories and memories, and an identity that is a vital part of the cultural ethos of the community. It represents, of course, Bengal and Indianness. Thank you.
Ritu, thank you so much for this presentation on kantha. And I'm very intrigued by this last bit when you're talking about relabeling. But there's a slight problem with using the Shantiniketan for the current forms and Nakshi for the older ones, because in Bangladesh, they are known as Nakshi Kantha, both the old ones and the new ones. So how might you kind of recalibrate this idea of the bridging between the old and the new?
You know, this is an issue that has come up many times because as the country was divided, we share our traditions across borders with Nepal, with Pakistan, with Bangladesh, with Sri Lanka. And I think it's not a problem. People seem to think it is. They seem to feel that we will lose it if we do. But we already have a GI on Nakshi Kantha. And if you look at it, it is actually fraught with problems. But first of all, the GI there, which states Nakshi Kantha, has been demarcated in the geographic area of only Birbhum, whereas the Kantha is embroidered across West Bengal. So first of all, anyways, no one else can call it by the name Kantha. That's number one. Number two, what has been detailed there is the old Kantha. So this issue had come up, I think Ashok Chatterjee will remember, about the issue of Jamdani also. And it had become very contentious. But the fact is there is a border. And the fact is that does it matter at the end of the day, whether it's embroidered this side or that side? And they do call it Nakshi Kantha there. And they are very welcome to call it Shantiniketan also because they revere Guru Dev Rabindranath Tagore. So I don't think this will become an issue if we decide not to make it an issue. But I was very nervous about even introducing the name. So I wondered if I should do it. So I rewrote my talk last night. But I thought it must be put out there because it is something that it is just a thought for discussion. So I want to just throw it there.
Is it on? Yes, now it's on. Okay. When you presented your talk, you spoke mostly about the modernization and the Shantiniketan kantha and after. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about the current, never mind the terminology, but the current understandings of kantha that are more variegated than your general presentation had time to take into account. So for example, there are so many people, both in India and abroad, who collect heritage kantha and who know what they are and appreciate what they are. And my understanding, which is very minimal, of production now is that there are some groups who are making, excuse me, very high quality work.
Yeah. In fact, there were, because of the time limit, I cut down many
Yes,
of the
I know.
groups that are working on heritage kantha.
So-
And the one I would really like to talk
Yeah.
about is Ruby Pal Chowdhury, who is the president of the Crafts Council of West Bengal, who in, I think, in 1996, set up the Kamla Devi Center for Heritage Kantha. And in fact, one of her embroiderers got the national award also. And they do the most amazing work, and they have been trained in heritage embroidery. They are inspired by the heritage, but they bring in motifs which are current around them. So they have taken the best, and they, just like the earlier pieces I showed you, which had Kalighat Pats on it, they too are working with the heritage, as are many other groups.
And that's just bringing in the heritage motifs, and contemporary motifs are so appropriate, since kantha, when they used to be made, were commenting on.
Yes, yeah. That is why I started with the first one, which had the Kalighat, and the pictures I have of those include young girls in pants on mobiles and on auto rickshaws and things like that. So there is a parallel tradition that goes on, but this is far more niche, the one on the head. This is a very frightening question that's coming up now.
No, just an observation, Ritu, because I think you're quite right when you talked about the possibility of labeling. Then we're into marketing,
Yeah.
and we're into marketing management. And that's an area which many scholars have a contempt for. And I think we have another challenge, which is to be able to bridge that.
Yes.
Because we, and particularly scholars, we had this the other day in Chirala, where 300 weavers came together thanks to Mohan Rao. And I was quite alarmed that issues of livelihood and of the security that we've seen in two presentations this morning were not even mentioned by the people who had a great deal of wisdom and scholarship. And when this was raised, they objected to what they called commodification. So one of the challenges that we have who work in this sector is to find a language which brings us together and doesn't divide us. Because we've already had, as you brought out, this example of Jamdani with
Creating
Bangladesh.
such an issue. Yeah.
But the important thing would be, where did that conversation go? It started in this city when there was a World Crafts Council meeting, and our Bangladeshi colleagues noted with alarm that India had got a GI for Jamdani. And they said, this is our Taj Mahal of crafts, and you guys, what are you doing? You've taken it away from us. Right? We hadn't done our homework, and neither had they. Because the GI for Jamdani in India was not in Bengal, it was in Andhra Pradesh. Okay? And when we met again in China, a few years later, the issue came up again. But in the meanwhile, the same issue had come up in connection with the Chinese imitation of Banaras brocade, right? And Chinese imitation of Kachi embroidery. When these issues came up, what we really need to go back to in this is, what do the artisans themselves have to say? Because when the Banarasi weavers was asked, what do you make of this situation of China dumping false and Indian traders thriving on this bogus Banarasi brocade, they said, what about Surat? Right? It's not just China, it's Surat as well. And what they said was that what we should be concerned about, and they use this wonderful word, is pehchan, is recognition. And the master weaver from Benares made this wonderful observation that if anyone in Bangladesh, which also does Benares weaves, Karachi, which also does Benares weaves, they said, we have to encourage them, not discourage them. But it is we artisans who will set the benchmarks for excellence. So in this now, it will be interesting to go back to the kantha embroiderers and ask them, what should be those benchmarks? And then what you label it may not matter. But the excellence will hopefully be something we can all hang on to. Thank you.
I think from my conversations with kantha embroiderers, with whom we work quite a lot, what is concerning them now is not so much the conflict between Nakshi Kantha and Shantiniketan Kantha, but the fact that this word kantha is used generically now across India for running stitch, which is tanka, and that in Rajasthan there are huge numbers of people who are stitching together old pieces of cloth and doing a running quilting on it and calling it kantha. And customers too can't really differentiate. And of course, the quality of the work, the prices are so different, and that is what is really posing a huge threat to genuine kantha embroiderers.
Yeah. Thank you, Ritu Sethi. Thanks so much.